Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be taking a look at some of the most recommended fantasy book series of the last few years, at least according to r/fantasy over on Reddit. Now, this is based on a post by a Reddit user called Cosmic Occurrence, who put together this really amazing metadata analysis of like 125 plus Reddit posts and analyzed 3,500 different book and series and author recommendations over on that subreddit. Now, as someone who works in marketing, who deals with data on a daily basis, I find this stuff super cool. I reached out to them, asked if I could make a video about it. They very graciously said yes. And here we are, a little bit later than I maybe first anticipated, but I still think this is a super cool post, and I want to talk about some of these numbers. Most importantly, these recommendations, because I think some of them may surprise people, especially for those diehard fans of things like epic fantasy. So let's kick things off at number 10. With 24 recommendations, we actually have a three-way tie between The Black Tongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman, The Earthsea Cycle by Ursula K. Le Guin, and The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. Now, I'm not personally super familiar with The Black Tongue Thief, but I think it's honestly super impressive that it's competing with names like Le Guin and Hobb, who I am personally a huge fan of, and I think absolutely deserve a spot on this top 10 list of recommendations. Now, one thing I think is really interesting is that Black Tongue Thief is a much shorter series, sort of in comparison. Of course, Realm of the Elderlings spanning like 16 plus books, including a lot of really popular, familiar ones, things like the Farseer trilogy, Live Ship Traders, and The Fitz and the Fool. Earthsea, of course, being one of sort of those seminal, quintessential classic fantasy series, so I have no real surprise that it's recommended here. Still, all of these years later, considering when the first one of those books came out, but these are somewhat older series, and I think it's pretty cool to see them still being here and so strongly recommended. In number 9, we have The World of the Five Gods by Lois McMaster Bujold. And I'll be honest, this is not a series that I'm familiar with, and I'm going to comment on this probably at least once more over the course of this video. Lois McMaster Bujold is an author who I'm like really not familiar with at all. Until I started doing the research for this video, I hadn't heard of her. I hadn't read one of her books. I hadn't even really necessarily seen them in bookstores. So to be actually one of the more recommended authors on this list, I was like, nothing against her. This is a failure on my part. Did I just totally miss something? Or is this one of those sort of sleeper authors who sort of come in under the radar? Because this is not a series that I'm necessarily familiar with. Originally called like the Chalian series, I think originally, and now all these years later, it's now changed to The World of the Five Gods. But still, I mean, the first one of these books came out over 20 years ago. And I'm honestly kind of surprised that I haven't read or heard of it. So that's interesting. Coming in at number 8 is Cradle by Will White. Now, this is a lit RPG / cultivation fantasy style series. The book is now, I think, 12 books long at this point, and one that I've personally been recommended quite a bit, especially for folks who watched my last video talking about lit RPG, its origins, and Dungeon Crawler Carl, of which I've now read all 6 books in the last 20 days. If you're wondering why there haven't been any videos on this channel, that's why that's the case. Wow, that series was good. And Cradle is often put sort of in the same company, and definitely one that I'm going to be checking out. Of all the ones in this list in sort of terms of immediacy, that's one that I definitely want to take a look at. Now, the number 7 spot, I don't think is going to be a surprise to anyone on this list who's read any fantasy books in the last couple years, is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. Now, this is the series that most people recommend, most people, myself included, if you've seen my Cosmere video, on this, the place to basically get started with the Cosmere. I think it is such a great intro to not only Brandon Sanderson's writing, but the Cosmere as a whole. I think it sort of totes this really great line of sort of YA, new adult, and then adult fantasy, even sort of over the course of the series, and sort of given the nature of the protagonist, and I think the world itself sort of has a really broad appeal to a bunch of different readers. So no real surprise seeing it here at number 7. At number 6 is The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. Now, I'll be honest, not my favorite book series of all time, and not for lack of trying, I will be honest. I think I read the first 4 books in the series, and I just couldn't keep reading them. Just something about, maybe it's a combination of his prose and the first person nature, but really it was just sort of that constant, like, Harry Dresden can never catch a break type thing. There's something about sort of the defeatist element of it. I don't know. I just really, maybe it's one of those series that I've got to go back to. But I do get why people recommend it. Like, I do understand looking at it like as objectively as I can. It also did so much for sort of the urban fantasy genre as a whole, and Jim Butcher is obviously massively critically acclaimed, so no real surprise to see it here on this list. At number 4 and number 5, we actually have a tie between the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie and the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. Now, I think this is fun that these are sort of sharing this 4 or 5 spot because these are two of my all-time favorite fantasy book series. When it comes to the things that I love in terms of epic scope, amazing characters, and really awesome action, it doesn't really get better than these two series. But one thing I do want to note, and probably my only real gripe with this sort of list and analysis, also the fact that it kind of skipped to number 5, but we'll get past that, is the fact that you look at like Realm of the Elderlings, which is like, again, a combination of all these different smaller series in a combined universe, putting that in at sort of the number 10 spot, yet opting to separate Sanderson, Stormlight Archive, and Cosmere, because, spoiler alert, if you actually combine these as part of the Cosmere, the larger works that they're a part of, Sanderson would actually be in second place, or the Cosmere would actually be in second place in terms of these recommendations. So again, not a huge thing, but again, not really surprised to see both series sort of very strongly recommended here. But I think on the whole, the Cosmere itself is absolutely something that I would see recommended a lot, and personally one that I'd probably recommend a lot as this goes. In third, I think, to no surprise to anyone, a book series that should pretty much be on every top fantasy book series recommendation list ever, of course, is Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. Now, some people might be a little bit surprised that this one's coming in at number 3. A lot of people sort of really tout this as maybe sort of that number 1 most recommended series. I know for a lot of folks, it's usually that sort of must-read series, like if you're going to go through and read all the top fantasy of the last 50 years, Wheel of Time needs to be on there. I think I do kind of understand, though, maybe why it's not sort of in that number 1 spot. I'll be honest, they're big books. They are weighty tomes. It is an investment both in money and time. And I think for a lot of folks saying, hey, are you going to invest all this time and energy into reading all this series? It might be daunting for some people. So I guess I do kind of understand why it's probably not at that number 1 spot. In second place, though, is a series that I'm very much glad is up there, and that's Discworld by Terry Pratchett. Now, I think this probably could have been argued sort of anywhere in sort of the top 5 on this list in terms of most recommended series. I think if you were to sort of poll a room of fantasy book fans, at least someone in that space is going to say The Color of Magic, widely considered one of the best, like the best fantasy books ever written. So really not surprised to see Discworld sort of up there on the top of this list, though I do think, and maybe some people would agree with me, this series does have maybe some more hit or miss books on there, which is maybe why it's not in that number 1 spot. But the book series in the number 1 spot, almost to the point of being a meme on the r/fantasy subreddit, of course, is Malazan by Steve Erickson. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't read Malazan. It's one of those books that this last year has been, for me especially, been one of these times where it's like, I'm going to go through and read all the classics. I've been making my way through quite a few of them, but Malazan is still on my list. One of these books that I'm definitely going to get to at some point. I've heard so many good things about it, and no real surprise to see it sort of up there at the top of this list. Now, these were the most recommended series. However, we also did sort of get a sort of a separate list, an adjacent list to this, some of the most recommended authors as well. And these are sort of, they do line up, but not quite one-to-one. No real surprise there, I think, given modern times, that Sanderson actually is back there at the top with almost 100 specific recommendations. But like I said before, Lois McMaster Bujold being up there near the top with so many recommendations, and I literally hadn't heard of her before this, I think is just bizarre. Again, this just feels like a total, like a gap in my education that I feel like I need to fix. And now just sort of, I feel like I need to go back and read some of these works because I just sort of, I gotta know. In terms of the rest of them, I don't think there's really any real surprises here. Maybe the big one that jumps out, of course, is Tolkien being so far down the list. And I think that's really where sort of the nature of what this list itself is sort of comes into play, because it's not the greatest fantasy book series of all time. It's the most recommended fantasy series of all time. And I think that is a huge distinction, and one we absolutely have to make, because, for a lot of folks, I don't think there's a lot of really big fantasy fans who haven't read Tolkien. Tolkien's not really one that a lot of people are recommending because they kind of assume that you've already read Tolkien. I think another one that's sort of up there, and I think seems kind of glaring on this list, is something like A Song of Ice and Fire, a series that I think a lot of people read early on in their fantasy journeys, albeit not on the YA end of things. At least I hope not anyway. But I think a lot of people are sort of coming in, they're saying, hey, I want to find books that are like A Song of Ice and Fire. Can people give me recommendations? Which I then think, things like Joe Abercrombie usually come in, and people are trying to find more of that grim, dark attitude or element. And I think that's where, when you look at this list again through this lens, okay, that starts to make a bit more sense. Now, still, looking at this list, was there anything here that really surprised you? I mean, for you watching this, if you're a big fantasy fan, are there any series that you're surprised either weren't on this list or weren't higher, or maybe should have been lower in the context of this? I'm really curious what you all think, because I think for me, really diving in and taking a look at the data, we really get to see in this the bias of Reddit. Now, Reddit obviously is a great platform for a lot of things, but for book recommendations, it definitely is hit and miss, partially because a lot of these specific subgenres, the things that people really look for, are split out into different subreddits. The fantasy subreddit might as well be the epic fantasy subreddit or the high fantasy subreddit, because you don't often see a lot of recommendations that don't fall within that sort of narrow spectrum. And let's be honest, still, though it is a little bit better than it used to be, Reddit is still very male dominated. So when you look at broader reading trends sort of out on the market, if you look at top books on Amazon and Goodreads and Barnes and Noble, you're not going to see the same books up there that are recommended, or on TikTok or Instagram, that you're going to see here on the fantasy subreddit. The fact that Romantasy is broken out as its own subreddit, cozy fantasy, all these other subgenres, really makes these recommendations, I don't want to say stale, but definitely very focused. The other thing that really stood out to me was the sense of time. Often on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, you will see recency being a massive factor. What is the newest book, the latest book? What's just come out? What are we going to be talking about? Whereas on Reddit, there's a huge emphasis on things like the classics. I mean, we look at this, the vast majority of recommendations came from the 2010s. And yes, while the 2010s were an amazing decade for fantasy, you kind of got to be surprised that there weren't more. I mean, like something like only like 19.6% were from the last the last couple years, which I guess is still a decent amount considering we're only in 2024. But still, I'm kind of surprised there weren't more recent books making a factor here and making a presence here. And I think a lot of this has to do with there's a lot of really big, awesome fantasy series that started in the last decade, but that still aren't done. So when we talk about, overall recommendations, there are maybe newer books that are getting recommended, again, like the Wind and Truth is coming out in a couple of months, but that series started like a decade ago. So when you sort of take all of those things in context, it makes a little bit more sense. But I think the real thing to look at here is, again, the fact that 55% of the authors that are recommended are men, which, if we do look at, again, broader reading trends, is actually quite different than where you would look for, again, on places like Amazon or Goodreads, etc. In fact, as of 2023, and you look at the Goodreads Choice Awards, less than a quarter of the top winners, and again, this is quite literally a popularity contest, were men. Like 16 of the top 20 of these authors were women. And but again, looking at that, you wouldn't think that looking at, again, this place like Reddit. In fact, it's so relevant or so prevalent, I should say, that I made a post about it sort of earlier this year. And even Mark Lawrence chimed in and commented. He's like, oh yeah, like don't look at the recommendations of r/fantasy. They're really not as representative of the larger market, which I thought was kind of interesting considering he was one of those men who won an award. That was last year for the Goodreads Choice Awards. So again, I think if you take all of these things into account, you're like, wait a second, Paul, so you're saying I shouldn't trust this list? And I'm not saying that. I think what my biggest takeaway from this out of anything is that the most important thing you can do when looking for book recommendations is look at who is giving you the recommendation. Do some research onto the person who is actually behind the camera or the keyboard and actually saying like, hey, this is what I'm recommending. Look at the shelf behind me as an example. Like, are these books that you also enjoy? Did I rate favorably books that you also liked? Just as an example. And you should be doing that for most people, because at the end of the day, where you get your review is very much going to impact whether or not you're going to like that book. Because again, the book recommendations that are coming out every day on TikTok and Instagram are going to be very different from the recommendations that you're seeing on Reddit. So again, I think it's more than anything, take a look at this. While I agree, I think there are a lot of great book series on here, I don't necessarily think this would actually be the most representative list of maybe what the actual best series are, especially if we take a look at, the last 20 years and beyond. I think there's a lot of stuff on here that definitely wouldn't be, it's not up there. And I also think it's important to note that just because something sells a lot doesn't necessarily also mean that it's a good book, quote unquote, especially in a day and age when all it takes is one viral TikTok or Instagram reel to really blow a book up. Maybe, out of proportion to how good it actually is. So at the end of the day, here are some good fantasy book recommendations. I don't think there's anything on this list that either I didn't recognize or necessarily didn't know, with one sort of big exception. And of these series, I've read at least part of quite a few of them, and there's definitely some winners on there. So if you're curious, again, to see more of the data, how things are broken down, I'll leave a link to both the post and the meta-analysis in the description. And I guess for all of you, where do you get your book recommendations? Is BookTube one of the big ones? I know it is for me personally. I really like seeing more of the mind of the person behind it and not just like some quick flashes on Instagram or whatever. But let me know. Are there certain, creators or influencers or places that you go that have particularly good recommendations? I'd definitely be curious to hear about them down in the comments. And of course, if you like this video and want to see kind of more stuff like this, where I really take a look at sort of the data, the metrics, all this kind of stuff, let me know, because it's something, like I said, that I do every day. And of course, like and subscribe if you want to see more. Awesome. All right, well, that's it. Taking a look at some of the best fantasy book recommendations of the last few years with actual numbers, which is always nice. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.